Welcome everyone today to today's topic on Intro to Governance, the principles of good governance for nonprofits and charities. And my name is Liz Tang. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the education coordinator for INTEGRAL. I'll be around hosting and monitoring the chat, as well as any sort of tech support that I can provide. So without further ado, we'll get right into it. We like to start off with a land acknowledgement that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. And I apologize if there's any skipping. My internet is struggling today. Namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, the Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Métis people of Alberta. And this includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And as part of INTEGRAL's ongoing learning and unlearning efforts in the area of Indigenous rights and truth and reconciliation, our team has begun a process of reflecting upon this land acknowledgement. We literally just had a meeting right before this. And so we are hoping that our efforts will better honor the spirit of the land acknowledgement and reflect our personal and organizational commitments and connections to reconciliation. And I'm very happy to introduce today's facilitator. This is Mike Grogan. I will spotlight him for everyone. And he is the president and CEO of INTEGRAL. From board governance to strategy development and sustainability planning, Mike has over 30 years experience where he's recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of our organizations. You know, our sectors are always changing. So thanks for taking the time out today, and you can take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Liz, and then greetings to all you all, y'all, as Liz would say. Really wonderful to have you here. We're always quite appreciative and honored of people joining our work. And as Liz said, this is for you. I mean, if there's questions or comments or things that you want to know, certainly during the session, the chat, if you can even do is put your hand up virtually. I probably won't see it, but Liz will take a look for it. Absolutely there. Our goal is that you get something out of this, that there's something of value for you. There's some resources afterwards on the little platform we built. But even after this, if there's questions that arise for you or things you want to go a little further on, this is why we're here. INTEGRAL is a capacity building organization. We work in a few really core areas, governance being one, board policy, board development, things like today. We do a lot of legal work for nonprofits, a lot of strategy work, and now leadership training too. So our job is to come alongside you to help you learn, to equip you for the work that you do, which is all over the place in this province. 30,000 nonprofits, even the range of different organizations on the call today is really wonderful to see. So thanks for being here. Today, we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk a bit about, let's move things off my screen so I actually see what we're talking about. We're going to talk about roles and responsibilities. It's kind of governance 101. We talk about governance in a few different ways. This is kind of the basics, and it doesn't particularly matter how long you've done board governance, how many boards you're on, how many boards you report to. I think returning to the basics of governance regularly is really important. I mean, I work for a board. We're a charity and nonprofit ourselves. I report to a board. I teach board governance. We consult with boards every day. And just to get back to some of those duties and responsibilities is really important, because in every board it's going to look different. And from time to time in every board, it's going to change. So what was a high functioning board a year ago may go through some changes. Good to get back to basics. So we'll walk through some of that kind of basic stuff of governance. We all need to know some different issues in governance, what you might do. We'll get to sort of a set of knowledge called governance. Governance is leadership, which kind of takes it to the next level. I think a lot of the things we see quite often in boards is that, you know, just like if it's just fiduciary, if it's just reading financial statements and listening to reports, is that all there is? No, there's not. There's a lot more to governance, and sometimes that gets lost in kind of the day-to-day or the general operations. And as always, we want to leave you some tools, some resources. We hope that there's things out there that can sort of prompt you in your journey along the way. So we'll try and get through all that. I'm going to start with a quote, though, because I like quotes a lot. And this is a really good one, because I think it sums up kind of both the essence of being on a board and probably the complexity of being on a board as well, is that boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. I love that opening line. It sort of tells you a lot about certainly the uniqueness, but also the boards are not quite like anything else. Nonprofit boards are very different. You are sort of put together sometimes by choice, sometimes by just opportunity, with folks who might have a similar passion to you, but maybe not. You're there for different reasons, and the way you express that passion, the skills you bring, the personality traits you bring. It's not like working in a team in a business. It's not like a sports team. It's not like a family. It is this very curious and unique structure, which has a tremendous amount of power. You have all the power in the world as the board. You may delegate some of that away. You may say we have an executive director, a CEO. We may delegate some to committees, but the board holds all the authority and all the power. But you have to act as a collective. You have to work only as a collective. There is no one on a board who has more power or more authority. You have different roles, but the board is a collective. So you have the structure where you have to work. I envision it sometimes to like the three-legged race, except you're tied to maybe 6 or 8 or 10 people, and you've got to walk and move together. That is a skill that is tricky to learn. But that's also where the power comes from boards, that idea, that curious structure that allows us to work as a collective. And you sit both atop and outside the organization. And I think for some people it's a bit challenging. Boards have all the authority. You are the final voice of authority. The responsibility of authority lands with you. That's the atop part. But when you're truly governing, you are a bit outside the organization. You're not necessarily doing the day-to-day work. Now, some boards also do that work, but you're not in the governance role then. You're more in the operational role, what we would call wearing a different hat. So there's that sense of being outside the organization, which gives you some perspective. It gives you a way of looking at things that are probably a little more than the minutia of day-to-day, but it also disconnects you from the work. So that's where we get a bit of the challenge to say, I got all the authority, I'm atop the organization, but I'm kind of outside it. So how do I make informed decisions? How do I govern when I have staff perhaps who do that, or committees or parts of the board that do some of that work? And that's the complexity. Nothing unsolvable. I think they're all opportunities here. There's all kinds of room for things to pop up that aren't perhaps so healthy, but there's all kinds of things we can work with in those dynamics. And you're both accountable. You're accountable to those inside the organization, those you serve, the clients, the stakeholders, the funders, perhaps, and those outside. There are regulatory pieces. There's that whole how do we fit into a changing society that we cannot separate our organizations from. So this is from an article from Stanford Social Innovation, came out a couple of years ago. I quite like this one. And it's a article about the 4 principles of purpose-driven leadership. And it's taking boards to a bit more of a social change, who are we as agents of change kind of world. So quite good. I think if it's not on the resource list, we'll pop it up on this fancy new website that Liz is building for us. Just to get you started, though, I'd like to hear a bit about you. So we're going to do a poll, I believe, right now. I'm going to turn it back to Liz. I'm going to go up to here. Oh, it launched already. There we go. On a scale of 1 to 5, what do we need to do for this, Liz? Just pump in some numbers?
Yep, that's right. So on a scale of 1 to 5, just rate your general understanding of nonprofit governance. And we'll wait till, the most of the 20 of us respond. Okay.
I think that's pretty good. Well, it seems it's 14 out of 14, but there we are. Yep.
There we go. So everyone should see it now.
So it's up there. I hope it's up there. What I see on my screen is sometimes not what you see in yours, but hey, what I see. So this is a great range. From one, I'm new to the topic, to I understand it quite a bit. Why am I teaching? Why are you not teaching this? That's what I think. There we go. This is fantastic. I think it's great to have a range of experience in this thing. And I say, I don't think there are experts in this world. I think that each board is so unique. There are some basics, some standards. We'll go through all that kind of good stuff. But the idea, bring your wisdom, bring your questions. If you've been on a board forever and you've got some insights to what worked well and what doesn't work well, love to hear from it. If you're brand new, so glad you're here, because I think this is a great learning piece. And again, we all need to sort of go through the basics time to time. Well, pretty even range almost is quite good. So there we go. To move on then, let's talk about what this thing is as a board. So I'm going to give you a bit more of a depth. I'm going to stop. Can I stop share results?
Yeah, you just have to kind of click out of it, but it's off there. Yeah.
Use this after several years of this whole thing. There we go. In a more technical definition, so I sort of talked a bit about the sort of, I think maybe a more creative definition of what a board is, the unique and curious leadership structure. This is from the Certified Professional Accountants of Canada, who, if you're looking for resources, there's some on our resource list. They're a fantastic set of resources for nonprofits. They're accountants, so they like the rules. They're pretty clean. It's Canadian, so you got to watch for that. So if you're in Alberta, just think about that a bit, but they're generally pretty good, but really accessible. It's not dense language. It's really well laid out. And they got a whole series of resources on risk management, social enterprise, what you need to know about sort of executive stuff. So they're a great piece, the Certified Professionals of Accounts of Canada. And this is their definition. The board is responsible for all aspects of the organization, including overseeing its operations and holding management accountable for delivering on the mission of the organization. Again, going back to that construct is the board is one in charge. Sometimes you look at organizations, you sort of think, well, who's really in charge? Who's leading this organization? And that may look different in some. At the end of the day, it is the board who has the legal responsibility, the legal authority to make decisions in an organization. And that's one thing the boards do. They need to make decisions that are the best, to make decisions that are in the organization's best interest. I think a really easy thing to say, sometimes tough to do. You get into competing demands, you get into personalities, you get into perhaps factions sometimes. We do see that on boards where you have somebody supporting an executive director, somebody who's not, somebody who's just there to support the executive director. Great to support your executive director, love to be supported. That's not the role of board. The board is to say we have to do things that are in the organization's best interest, which is a bit tricky because that's not always really apparent as to what's in the organization's best interest. There is some subjectivity to it. It changes from time to time. And what I might believe as one person is in terms of the best interest of the organization might not be with you. But overall, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to elevate the organization, not one program, not one funder, not one person. What does it mean to elevate the organization and do what is in their organization's best interest, which may include things like not being an organization, to say that it's time to wind down. We'll talk a bit about that at the end, because it's tough for boards to engage in that kind of work. So we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities. When we talk about where things probably go wrong in organizations on governance, roles and responsibilities and being unclear. We do board assessments. Sometimes we do deeper work with organizations. Part of our work is to do free, we do workshops like this, usually free. We do clinics and one-on-ones. We'll talk to you about kind of anything you want to talk to you about. And then if there's more work, we do some deeper dives for a fee for organizations. And when we do that, sometimes we assess boards. And one of the things we see, I think, really commonly is that roles are not clear. You might have roles written down somewhere in policy manuals, or they're kind of there, haven't updated in 10 years. Role clarity is probably the biggest thing. And that idea, if it's clear, at least people know the guidelines, they know the rules, they know what the lanes are. When the lanes get blurry, you start bumping into each other a bit more and things get a little rougher. So role clarity is super important. So things for a board, we'll talk about the whole board. You're talking about this collective. That's 3, 4, 10 members, whatever it is. There are groups that have different sizes of boards, but they have some basic things that all boards do. So we talk about the board as a whole, then I'll talk about individually. You focus on the whole organization. And what that means is, you might be an accountant coming to a board and saying, I'm just here to look at the books. I'm just here to make sure we're on top of things financially. We're doing that fiduciary duty. Fantastic, great stuff. Bring that skill. But your job is for the whole organization, not just the one part you have some skills in, or you have an interest in one program. I love that, home care program we do. That's all I really care about. The rest I don't care. Your job is for the whole organization, for the administrative, for the programmatic, to the oversight, all that kind of stuff. So you focus on the whole thing. You may spend time in different parts of it. You can't ignore the rest of it. You don't fit your interests or your skills. You work together as a whole. The idea we're a collective. So working together as a whole and speaking with one voice. Again, easy to say, tough to do. So how do you work as a whole? Well, that's the idea that we do need to work on that. One of the things that boards don't do well is they do not attend to the board itself. We like boards, they focus on the whole organization. We're pretty good about saying we should go here, or we'll oversee financial stuff or make some decisions. But what we see very few boards do is attend to the board as a team, that board as a group, the board as a unit that can actually make a decision and speak with one voice. So to work together as a whole and speak with one voice are quite connected, I think. Speaking with one voice does not mean there's not disagreements on a board. I think it's really healthy and probably a sign that you're in a good space if you have some disagreements within the board meetings themselves or the structure of the board decision process, whether it's a meeting or not. Outside of that process, so there's the need to speak with one voice. So around the table, I may go, sort of back and forth and say, I disagree. We're going to debate that, hopefully respectfully, hopefully healthily. But what happens outside the board table is we have consensus. And the idea we have one voice. And consensus doesn't mean we all agree. It just means that I believe that consensus is that all voices are heard in your process, and out of it comes one voice. So if it gets to the point, though, where we can't speak with one voice, that's the time you need to think about stepping off the board. If the board is saying, I am so offside with this one way we're going, I probably can't be on the board. So you can't have situations where the board, you say, well, the board did this, but I wasn't in agreement. Inside the room, yes. Outside the room, no. Brutal for staff, brutal for stakeholders, brutal for the community to have that sense of division. We see it a lot. This doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it shouldn't happen, okay? Proven policy and moderate impact. We'll talk about different structures of boards. Sometimes you have boards and, about maybe half the boards in this province have some sort of staff that report to them. About half don't. So they still have a governance function. So when you're governing, when you're being on a board, you govern. The way you govern is through policy. You set these, they don't have to be overly complex. They need to be sort of well thought out to say, these are the guidelines that drive our work. So we do it through policy. Whether you're doing the work or not, or you've hired somebody else, all boards govern and you monitor the impact of what you do. If you have staff, and generally there's a few exceptions to this, but the idea that you hire and supervise one employee. So at Integral Org, we have a board, we have a staff of 7 or 8 folks, 7 I suppose. But the board has one employee. I am the one employee of the board. The organization has 7 and I supervise them and they report to different folks, but the board has 1. And so it's the idea that board members aren't sort of supervising 5 or 6 people. The board isn't sort of having day-to-day interaction with a number of people. They're not sort of working at cross purposes if there's a senior executive. So it is a way of keeping those lines and those roles really clear. Sometimes you'll get situations, sometimes you see it in arts organizations, where they have a business manager and artistic director, so you have this duality. There's a reason for that. You have to focus on a lot of different dynamics, like the interaction, the process between those 2 senior executives, a little rare. So traditionally, which isn't always the best way, you kind of have this one employee sitting between the board and the rest of the staff. And you do try and avoid management and operational decisions. It's one of the hard things for boards. I think boards love to get into the weeds sometimes. I'm on a board. I love getting into the weeds, and you have to sort of draw yourself back from that to say, okay, no, my job here is to think longer term, think strategically, make sure we're on track oversight wise, but it's not to sort of be picking photocopier toilet paper or to get into those kind of things. So how do you sort of make sure that we are, staying that right level? So I'll give you some tips for that as well along the way here. So those are basically the basics of board governance as a board as a whole. But the other part of it is we're made up of individuals. There are directors, individual directors on a board. And you have some duties there as well. So the board as a whole, but these individuals come to, so what am I responsible for as an individual on a board? So you have 2 really general duties of a board, and these are kind of the fiduciary duties, we call them. And these are the duty of care, which I'll read to you because it gets a little kind of complex and I think a little gray on this one. To act with the prudence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise would exercise in comparable circumstances. So that is the idea. You bring your own judgment, you bring who you are, you bring your experience, you declare conflicts of interest, things like that. Where this gets a little gray in my mind is pretty subjective. With the competence and due diligence that a reasonably prudent person would be, what I might think is reasonably prudent is kind of maybe different what you might think of that is. To gauge similar knowledge and experience, yeah, maybe we can figure that out. And what comparable circumstances are. So there's a lot of wiggle room on this. What it comes down to is you bring your experience, you come prepared, you declare conflicts, you are there to care for the organization. It does also bring into things like, again, back to the accountant one. So if I'm an accountant, I'm not just there to care for the finances. It does say there are some responsibilities. And you get sometimes in boards where you're saying, well, maybe you have a nurse on the board and an accountant on the board. It doesn't matter the professions, and the nurse says, I don't really know anything about finances. The accountant's going to take care of that. Yes, the accountant has more experience. They have more expertise. They're held to a higher standard, perhaps. Doesn't mean that the person without accounting experience has no obligation that way. So you're still responsible for trying to learn, to ask your questions, to bring your experience to it. So just because you don't have a skill set in a certain area does not mean you're absolved from responsibility in that area. So where you start from is who you are, your experience, your wisdom, your expertise, all that stuff. Bring it to it, declare your conflicts, bring your best self to that board in the interest of the organization. The duty of loyalty is to act honestly and good faith in the best interest of the organization. Again, we're all about the best interest of the organization. So again, this is things like I'm not here just to support a certain program. I'm only here because, my mother is the board, the CEO, and I want to support her, those kind of things. It is that I need to do what's best for the organization, to act honestly in that, to act with good faith, to make sure that my interests are to care for and to build this organization. This one gets tricky if you have organizations that you have people who are appointed to the board. So most organizations have either elections from membership, sometimes the membership just is the board itself. There's different ways of getting there, but sometimes boards, and you see them that interface with public sector sometimes, or where you have regional representation on a board, where somebody says, I'm an executive director of one organization, but I've been appointed to this other board. The question that arises for us is, who are you loyal to? Are you loyal to the organization you're from, your own organization, and to bring their interests to the board? Or are you there to support the board you've been appointed to? Those may not be the same thing. So you get this sort of conflict sometimes, saying when people are appointed to boards, who are they really loyal to? And you can't really pull those apart. And that's the tough one. So I think we do see that in at least some of the more recent engagements or structuring pieces we've seen where people are moving away from such a style, where that representation, you're there by virtue of your position, that's maybe losing a bit of favor. It's still commonplace in many places. So anyway, how do you bring your best self to do what's best for the organization along the way? Just a quick comment on other roles in the organization. Oops, I skipped over one. No, I didn't. There we go. Just where this comes from, this is not just made up stuff. There are some things that guide why we say boards, what boards can do collectively and what you can do individually. You have legislation. For most organizations in Alberta, about 75% of them, 30,000 nonprofits in this province, probably more who are incorporated elsewhere. That's a lot of nonprofits, in case you're wondering. We probably crank out more nonprofits than I think anywhere else anywhere probably. So we get a lot in Alberta, there's lots of reasons for that. But most of you are societies. So 3/4 are societies, and the Companies Act, and then various acts like libraries and ag societies, things like that. Societies is the big one. There's the legislation in the Societies Act. You probably don't need to go read it. You could if you like. It's kind of dense and hard to follow, but it gives you the authority. It's what the government has said. We're going to create legislation that says there are certain things in the world that are good for the public, that we need to make sure there's people doing those things. So they created a Societies Act that says, we're going to give you some protection. We're going to give you a structure and some guidelines and some ways of doing things that allow you to be a nonprofit. And from that, then we have this whole group of nonprofits forming who have objects. These are the things that we're going to do. We're going to end hunger. That's a great object to have. So there's the reason we're here, the objective of what we're doing here. Narrows it down. So it's going to funnel from big legislation to why we're here. Bylaws, these are how you're going to be governed, who a member is, how members become members, how we get rid of members, how meetings will be held, where records are being kept. These are kind of the rule book for how the nonprofit works, how it equips itself. Then we get into policy procedures. They're a little more than nuts and bolts, how we'll do things. This is our IT policy to make sure we're safe. This is a board policy to make sure we know that board members are being trained, things like that. So it takes you down from really broad legislative stuff, if you don't need to know that, into the sort of nuts and bolts where if you're running a nonprofit, bylaws, yes, you probably should be aware of those things, policies, always ongoing work. So there are some good things to work with there. And on the source here is the board governance guidebook. This one, the Alberta Board Governance, the Community Development Unit of the Alberta Board Development Program has some great stuff on how to develop policies and procedures and all that kind of stuff. Again, that'll be in the resource thing. So some things we want to do as a board. Where do boards spend their time? You ensure and practice good governance. Fantastic. Take care of yourself. Again, probably the most under-resourced, under-focused on part of governance. Take care of your team first. We put that to the back burner, wonder why things don't work. Practice good governance. Make sure you're developing staff, building relationships, all those kind of good things. And you really focus on the long-term sustainability of the organization. We kind of get drawn down into sort of the minutiae sometimes and day-to-day stuff. And there's a reason for that. There's an oversight duty that's really important. But we need to make sure we're carving out time to think what's coming up the next year or 2, 5, 10 years out. That is probably one of the primary responsibilities of the board. And we'll get back to that strategic side in a bit here. Ensuring you have some strategies. I mean, there is a role for boards to make sure that, okay, we know where we're here. We have this objective, perhaps to end hunger. But how are we going to get there? What are the steps along the way? And those are a year or 2 or 5. Doesn't matter how long your strategy is. But we actually have something that narrows it down from this big, broad initiative or objective to these are the steps along the way for the next few years. That's really important for boards because if not, you kind of wander, get blown back and forth by funding, personalities, circumstances along the way. Again, when you hire, guide, and direct the senior executive, 1 employee usually for boards, that's part of our job. We ensure that the policies that we have are up to date and current. The number of times that people say, yeah, we got a policy manual, we haven't looked at it for 20 years, not really sure where it is, then you probably don't have policies. And you're probably not governing where you should, because there is some expectation that if you're on a board, you are keeping things current and up to date. Attend your own continuity, developing, recruiting board members, really important. hard to do. I think we're seeing there are challenges in boards. This is a longer term trend for us, is that it's tough to get folks on a board sometimes. I mean, there's some boards that are really attractive, but overall, you're seeing volunteerism has taken a hit over the decades, certainly. And COVID, I think, really challenged volunteerism a lot. So the way people are coming back is not the same as before COVID. Board governance and joining a board it's not dated. I think we certainly see people joining boards, but if you think there's 30,000 nonprofits incorporated in this province, 5 to 8 board members each, that's 250,000 people on boards. That's a lot of people, really. And it's hard to get people on board. It's hard to keep them on there. So that idea of keeping your board functioning in a healthy place, and a fun place, and a productive place is really important, because it's not necessarily easy work. It's easy when things are going well and you got a good team and things are rocking. When if you're struggling financially or having start turnover or things aren't going your way, it's a tough part to be placed to be on a board. So the more you can do to make sure the board's healthy, I think the better it is to have people there. And they're ambassadors for the organization. This is one of the key roles, I think, that we underplay sometimes in organizations, is that board members get to speak for an organization in ways that other people can't. One is their job, so they are to promote the organization and do whatever is best for an organization. But if you're an executive director or a staff member, there's a bit of maybe a perception that you're there for your own interest. I get paid to work for Integral Board. So if I speak for Integral Board, I do believe in the organization. I think I'm a good ambassador for it. But if you were to hear one of my board members talk about it, who are volunteers and lay people who bring that voice to the equation, that has a different weight to it as well. So the idea they can speak in ways that other people cannot. Just so we get when we talk about roles and responsibilities, I think the best thing is to know that there are some different layers in organizations. It may look a little bit different than yours, because if you don't have staff, you blend kind of the bottom ones. But you have governors, the board of directors. They're setting the tone, future direction, policy development strategy. Again, the overarching piece. If you have staff, then you have a senior executive. They manage, they interpret that policy, they coordinate the day-to-day, allocate resources. They're making sure that things are well managed. And then people doing the work, whether it's staff or volunteers. Sometimes in small organizations, these get blended a bit. But again, if you're on a board of a small organization that does all the work yourself, you need to separate out that governance role, because the work you do as a governor is a little bit different, is a lot different than what you do as implementing the work. So we talk about wearing different hats. Today I'm here running the booth we run at a hockey game because I'm a volunteer. Tomorrow night I'll be on the board sort of overseeing the hockey rink kind of stuff. So you can only make them so clear, because it gets, it's still the same people doing the same stuff in some ways. But that clarity goes a long way. So lots of guidance on that in terms of the board development resources as well. It's how you separate out working boards from governing boards. All boards govern, not every board does the work themselves. We're going to talk about board and staff here. So this is one that I know some of you don't have, but many do. So just some basics on board governance and how we work with staff here. So again, the staff, if you've got an executive director, the board has one staff person. So I won't talk about any of it sort of below that line right now. But the relationship with the board and the staff is really complex sometimes. And this is like any relationship, you got to work at it. There's kind of an adage in the nonprofit world sometimes that either boards run roughshod over CEOs or CEOs run roughshod over boards. So how do you make sure that you're actually working in this balanced, productive, healthy, well-defined way? And as relationships go up and down and boards change and CEOs change, you got to work in a lot of time. So how do you have a healthy relationship? Well, know what each other does and is supposed to do for one thing, and then work on how we want to work together as well. So it's CEOs, executive directors, the terminology might be a bit different from here to there. Execute strategy and manage the operations. You're the ones overseeing the ship. You're driving the ship right now. Somebody else maybe owns the ship. You're the one driving it. Building relationships with internal and external stakeholders. I'd say internal as well, perhaps. Sometimes the role for board in this is not excluding the board, but this is the face of the organization quite often. This is the person who's out there getting known, seen as the organization, the person to promote the organization, to contact, to participate with other organizations. It is that external relationship piece. Always that reporting back. And this is the idea of how do boards make decisions if they don't know? Well, you need to know. And a lot of times that's going to come from the staff or that single staff person to report back on financial, operational, strategic matters. We'll get into that challenge of the boards having to make decisions when they're disconnected from this community. How do you do that? A lot of that flow is through the CEO or the executive director, which is challenging because my board knows what kind of I want to tell them. So, how do you make sure they're getting enough information without getting into the weeds? Is a bit of a balancing act. Preparing budgets and operational plans. Budgets may be a shared one sometime. Operational plans is usually the role of senior staff. Budgets may be a shared one. There's always board approval on budgets, perhaps board approval on operational plans, as they should be joined. But sometimes you have boards take this on, sometimes staff, sometimes it's shared. And I guess with all these things, there's the theory can say one thing. The reality is that there's a lot more gray in some of these things. So how it works for you may be a bit different than this, but make sure it's clear no matter what you do. So the idea of tensions is really a part of being on a board. And tensions are usually a good thing if we manage them well, but they're not always. There's a theory and a practice which are a bit disconnected sometimes. Supports the development of the board. And so it's not a job of the CEO to make sure the board's developed, but if there's ways the CEO or the executive can support your development, that's really important because they have information, they have access to resources, they have access to knowledge that you may not have. But again, it's the board's responsibility for their own good governance, their own practice, their own teamwork. And the board, the CEO or executive can request consultation and support from the board in their individual areas of expertise. And this is if you have somebody in your board who's an HR expert, perhaps. And myself as a CEO can say, yes, I got an HR issue. I got to talk to somebody. Board members sometimes will do that within their professional disciplines and sometimes not. So lawyers sometimes are reluctant because you're giving advice in ways that you can't. There's a difference between advice and information, and sometimes they can sort of work around that. So some people do this, some do not, up to them. But for me to say, I have a HR issue, I know I got an HR expert on my board, can I run a few things by you? Can I get some guidance and some wisdom by you? The important thing that's driven from the staff up to the board. This is not the board saying, hey, I'm an HR expert. I got things to tell you. Let me sit down with you. You may make that offer, but you're not directing individually that way to those operational things. So it is that consultation, the support of the board in the individual functional areas, which is really important, I think, and a great resource for organizations. And as we recruit, those are the things you think, well, what do we need to run an organization? We do need some HR help, perhaps, or legal help, or financial help, that it can both help the board do its work, but also support the operational stuff in an appropriate way. So some differences we see between board and staff are these, is that you keep moving things around. This little Zoom window just keeps popping up in different places. The board acts as a group. You are a collective. Yeah, hit that note 1,000 times. The staff act individually. So you got one staff, I'm here as an individual. We might be a team, obviously, but we are individuals. You are a collective. As an entity, boards are an entity that's like one person. Staff are a collection of individuals. You're continuous. There's not this board and that board. The board is the board. Until the organization is no more, that is the board. The board is not the last board or board 20 years ago. It's this kind of amorphous thing that is always there. Where staff are temporary, that we act at the will of the board. We could be gone tomorrow. And that's just the reality of being staff, is that you may not have staff, you may not have you as staff, but boards are always there. Boards are elected or appointed. So you choose to, that is part of it. Somebody chooses to put you on that board, or maybe it's a little, quicker than that because there's no one else it's just the board being the membership. But staff are usually employed or contracted, so it's transactional. Again, board voluntary, staff paid. There's an orientation towards the future. And I think you put a bit of a star beside this one, because I think there are boards that probably span this one a bit, both and. But there is a role that boards should take their time to look towards the future and trust the staff that manage the day-to-day. A bit more of a shared responsibility, but boards sit in a place where that's really important for them. The board can set policy, assign authority. We receive authority and enact policy as staff. And board are largely lay people, and staff are more professional. Not always. And it's not that there's not experts and professions on boards. You may have all kinds of experience. But in the work that your organization is doing, this is what's happened in the nonprofit world in probably the last 30, 40 years, is an increased professionalization of the nonprofit sector. So in certain disciplines like fund development or things like that, but even in terms of nonprofit management, the skill set for nonprofit folks, the training of nonprofit and nonprofit disciplines, is the board may bring an interest to it, but we have experts who run it. So I'm on a board that is working with eating disorders. I have an interest in eating disorders, but I have family history in that. But I'm a layperson. I don't know the clinical stuff. I don't understand some of the ways that sort of treatment programs work. But we got that's what we have staff for. We have other experts to do that. So in my professional world, when I'm a staff here, I'm very good at running nonprofits my entire career. So there's a difference between what we bring. No less valued, not a judgment on who you are, but staff are largely professional and the board are largely lay people. Some of the things we're seeing in boards right now, and this is just as we engage with boards and just conversations like this and all kinds of stuff. Again, lack of clarity. I think it's the root of a lot of issues in boards right now. Just, board members' roles, responsibilities. What am I supposed to do on this board? I guess, again, challenge is engaging, utilizing skills and expertise of board members. Well, I'm here, I got something to do, but how do I bring my best without stepping out some of these lanes that you're talking about? I can't get into management, I'm supposed to do in this kind of stuff. What can I do? How can I bring my best self, my expertise to the board? Hard to do sometimes to get that level of engagement, that clarity. Sometimes there's really poor and fractured relationships. The idea that this is a group that you're with, but not necessarily by choice sometimes. Through COVID, we saw all war sometimes, where a group saying, I was the other half of a board. How do I do that? Well, I'm not going to help you with that, but we can help you read your bylaws or maybe build some relationships. But it is tough, especially when things get trickier out there and some of the challenge organizations grow. Some of those personal tensions rise to the top. And coming out of COVID, where there's lots of personal tensions in households and individuals and businesses, it's no different, I think, in board relationships in the nonprofit sector. Again, recruiting and engaging board members is tough to get people these days. So the more we can do to be healthy organizations, how to be inspirational and aspirational, how do we make sure that, hey, we're an organization that people really want to be a part of. And it is a bit of a marketing of the organization, including the board, to say, this is something you want to be a part of. 30,000 nonprofits, lots of good causes, probably not 30,000 unique causes. So when you think, well, there's no one quite like us, there's somebody pretty close like you. So no matter who you are, where you are, and the reality is if INTEGRAL went away tomorrow, there'd be some other place for people to volunteer and something like us would rise from the ashes of it. Not going to happen, I hope. But recognize that, how do you make sure that you are someplace that people want to be? Staff, board, volunteers, funders, clients, all that kind of stuff. You do have to figure out what your competitive advantage is that way. And then getting the work done. How do we organize our work? Which is ongoing work. Sometimes we build structures for boards like committees and how we do our meetings, and we stick with them for years. And you think that, does that really work for us anymore? I joined a board once and it had like 14 committees and there were 12 board members. And you kind of do the math in your head going, holy smokes, there's gonna be a lot of committees. And so you realize that was a construct that has never been looked at for years. And think, okay, let's do some work. Does it really fit where we are? So that idea of how do we structure our work, whether it's the type of meetings we have, how we do meetings, how we do committees, all that kind of stuff. Again, ongoing work, good governance, take a look at it. Does that suit the way we want to do things? There's no one way to do things. Just because you've done it before doesn't mean it's the best way to go forward. So those are some of the issues we see these days. Some of the things we want to work on. When it comes down to it, though, a lot of times it is three basic concepts that makes a healthy board, I think. And some areas we can all tune up because anybody can do this kind of stuff. And these may be just questions to ask around your board table. So, how well do our board capacities? What do we have to actually help us do our work? Do we have enough people on the board? Are our processes the right process? The way we do things, having our meetings, the terms of reference, our committees, are the roles clear? The time we have to do things, do they work for us? So the capacity to do our work as a board, not as a whole organization, as a board. And these are, we often do a fairly simple exercise with organizations when we're doing a little more deeper work in this area is to say, what's currently working well for us? What do we need to let go of? What do we need to add to the mix? So some basic ways of framing in terms of each of these three areas, what we might do to tune these things up. So our capacities, the ability to do our work, what's working for us, what's not. The connections, the idea of how meaningful and effective are the connections amongst the board. If you're going to work with people and do significant and sometimes challenging work, do you build time for connections? Do we know each other? Do we know each other's how we work? What our preferred way of speaking is? Do I understand when somebody says something, okay, you're going to say something really strong, but I know that there's something behind that. Do we have that understanding of who we are as individuals and our own styles? Do we have connections between the board and the CEO? Are we building that relationship? Are we working well with each other? And then with the community as well. So the idea of where are we strong on connections inside the board, with the rest of the organization, with the world outside, to work on those things, not just to assume that they are in place. And then culture. And this is, I think, where a lot of things fall down. What is the culture of the board? What are our expectations of each other? So a little similar to the first two, but probably taking a bit more to that. What are the norms you're going to work on? How are we, what are the beliefs we have? How do we plan to engage each other? What do we mean about listening and respect and all those kind of collective things? It goes back again to that idea of working as a collective, being tough. And part of the collective stuff is we may have the best policies in the world. We may have like super well-run meetings. They start on time, they end on time. They're perfectly minuted. We never stray from the agenda. But is that getting the culture of the organization, the type of dialogue you want to have? And boards at their heart are groups that they listen and discern and make decisions. That's a cultural thing as much as a process piece. So how do we attend to the culture? Being clear what we want, who we are, and how we want to be. So all three of those are areas that we can tune up without a lot of help in some ways. These are really questions of what's working well, what we want to let go of. There's always stuff to let go of, and what do we need to add to the mix. Some just ways of sort of thinking through all that kind of stuff. I want to give you one more little bit of knowledge here, and this is the idea of what's beyond kind of the traditional oversight role of board. It doesn't exclude that, but it gets into this concept of knowledge called governance of leadership. The stuff I've been through up until now, I would call governance 101. Kind of the fundamentals of governance. It's pretty portable across different jurisdictions. It is what it means to be a good government. This is some work that came out about 10 years ago from 3 authors. And they weren't critical of that traditional governance model because they recognized there's a great place for it and very much needed place, but it wasn't quite enough. And it was leaving people a little dissatisfied with the board experience. And they framed around the idea that governance discussions had focused on fiduciary duties, that oversight, stewardship, keeping the ship from sinking kind of stuff. But not as agents of change or, and innovation. So how can boards push the mission of organization, not just oversee financial statements? And they did it in this way, three different concepts. The governance incorporates 3 interconnected modes. The key word would be interconnected. The idea that these are not, just pick one, they do connect and you can't separate them out. The fiduciary, which is focusing on the organization's assets. Governance 101, covers that a lot. So things that we do, taking care of assets, overseeing audits, budgets, risk management, executive performance, the functional part of boards. We do a lot of that stuff, and it's really important. You need to do that. If you don't have this right, all kinds of things go wrong, regulatory, legal, disarray, turnover, all that kind of stuff. Doesn't mean those things don't happen, but better when you're on top of it. This is really clearly defined roles. The board governs, sets policy, expectations, maybe delegates some authority to the executive director. The staff implement these things. So really clear roles in this one. Fiduciary governance lends itself to clear roles, responsibilities, because we can assign all these sort of stewardship or oversight activities to one group or another. It's important for the board, it's necessary and essential, but it does limit the board's roles. So if you're only reviewing financial statements and listening to a CEO report, and then ... here's the new lease agreement or whatever it is, those are really important things, but they get a little limiting sometimes. If I don't have much to say about finances, I don't really care about the lease, don't understand it perhaps, all those kind of things. You kind of then dial down into certain people taking care of the fiduciary stuff and other people maybe perhaps rubber stamping it. So it's an important part, but if you only stick on the fiduciary side of things, you probably don't grow. You don't stretch yourself to say, okay, the basics are in place, then what do we do? So when we move forward to the next ones, it is important these are in place, that you're a strong fiduciary organization before you start thinking about the next. Because if you sort of go on with a weak foundation, you kind of crater it by the end, I think. So the next part is strategic focus on creating that strategic partnership or plans or management. What's coming up in the next 1 to 3 years is kind of my frame for strategy. No magic to that. You can go as long as you want. But what are those steps along the way that we need to take in the next nearest term that are going to get us to where we want to go? Our mission, our objective, trying to end poverty or food security stuff. What are we going to do? What's the 3 things we want to do in the next 10 things, whatever it's going to be in the next few years? So this starts to be a bit more engaging the board. You bring in their wisdom, their thought leadership, no matter where you are. This is the idea of blending all kinds of perspectives, which is really good for the board, to the idea of how are we going to advance our mission? So some boards would have the staff write an executive or strat plan. Sometimes the boards hold all that. A lot of times I think these are really shared things. This is a shared one. So board setting, being involved in that strategic focus beyond strategic planning. We tend to times put strategic planning into a box of 3 to 6 months, whatever it might be, and then let it sit for a few years. Not a great way to do it. It's an ongoing attitude and directional piece that guides us in both in our day-to-day work, but something you just don't do one and done. So in this case, though, there's a bit of a differentiation. The board is on the concepts of the plan. The staff is going to enact that plan. They do merge together. But the board is not sort of writing the activity levels of the plan, perhaps. You move to that idea of partnership here. The roles are clear, but it's a partnership. It's a shared responsibility. Largely from the CEO and the staff. The CEO may bring up the staff as well. And you need a lot more communication in this sense. You need to, this is the being a top and outside the organization. You have the responsibility. Outside it means I don't have the information the staff have. No board member will ever have the information level that staff have in an organization. But board members are trying to make strategic decisions, so how are they informed? how are they resourced? How do they have the knowledge to be able to say, okay, I can now start to see a path for the next few years here because I have enough information. So we need more knowledge, understanding of issues. There's a lot of talks and dialogue here, reporting, all that kind of good stuff. So we've laid out the sort of the short term, taking care of assets, the medium term, the next few years for us. There's a piece though that can be quite powerful for boards. And it's the idea of generative governance. And it is the sense making of the future and exploring options. This is beyond strategy, it can be a link to strategy perhaps, but it's looking out perhaps 10 years and to say, you know, we're going to be in 10 years, you know, for our industry, what's going to happen in 10 years? So we did some work with natural gas producers, a co-op of them, their association. And for them, they were starting to wrestle with this question and say half the board saying, yeah, well, we'll be just doing the same thing we're doing today. And the other half board saying we don't exist in 10 years, that fossil fuels are on the way out. That's a generative question that if in your, and it doesn't matter if it's so, you know, the fossil fuel ones are probably a little more clean cut, maybe not, probably wasn't on that board. But if you're in demographics, you're a children's serving agency. What's happening in children's services? What are the demographics of kids? What are the demographics of seniors? If you look at the demographics, how the population is going to change from, I don't know, 20% now of seniors to mid 30s in the next 15 years. That's a driver for not just seniors agencies, it's a driver for children's agencies. It's a driver for funding and taxes and donations. Those are generative questions that you start to think about, how is this going to affect us? And it may be a little more disconnected than the direct day-to-day stuff, but it's important to think about these things. So, you know, generative governance moves that role into that sense maker. Where do we really fit? We created this organization, we joined this organization, whatever it is, you know, we're going to be 5-10 years out. Who really are we? It may not just be a time constraint, you know, what's coming down the road 10 years from now. This could be, should we exist? Is it time for us to look at a merger or just, you know, wind down because our job is done? You know, we sometimes have this notion that nonprofits are eternal. Well, they shouldn't be eternal. They should sort of be time bound. Maybe we accomplished our mission. We tend to write missions that are not accomplishable, so we tend to guarantee some longevity. But one of those really deep questions, we're seeing more merger work right now in this sector than I've ever seen before. And it used to be a bit of a stigma to that, saying, well, one group failed and they're being taken over. That's largely not the case. It is boards saying there is a better way to do our work. And perhaps if we engage in a pretty significant partnership in that case, those cases, that's a better way to do it. Those are really healthy boards because they're not just reacting to we lost a contract or we're struggling with something. They're saying, we know we can survive, perhaps. There's a better way to advance our mission. And this is where it gets back to that opening line, the saying that boards are responsible to work in the best interest of their organization. Yes, legally true. There's also probably a nuance to it, though. I think you're responsible to advancing your mission. And maybe the organization is not the best way to advance your mission. So that quote from Stanford on the curious leadership structure, the board structure, you know, has a concept of purpose before organization. That's a bit heretical in traditional board governance stuff. What if you put your purpose first and the organization second? Tough to do. We say we do it sometimes. Tough to do in reality. This is a very creative, inclusive, thought-provoking. This is not about coming up with answers. This has got stuff like what might be, what might happen out there. It can be, if you're, you know, want to get stuff done and sort of nuts and bolts kind of person, this is kind of annoying kind of work to do. But it's really important. You start to dream of what's coming up in the world. You have these sort of sense-making, generative conversations. We do scenario planning with organizations sometimes, and it fits into this as well. You know, if this happens, what would you do? We're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to equip you to say, there's this muscle of sort of generative thinking that we can help you build. It's tough sometimes for staff to be involved in this. It moves it into that, because we're really wrestling with things that don't necessarily fit our day-to-day reality today. You know, staff saying, well, we don't do things that way. Well, fair enough. We're not trying to figure that out. We're not doing operational planning. But staff who have been charged with building an organization and being proud of it, and sometimes being quite territorial about that, not that boards can't be, it's tough to sort of challenge the status quo, to think about things that can be a little heretical or really out there, or don't think they're going to happen. But important for us to do that. I think that's where boards have a role to play. Not as equal. I don't think there are 3 equal pillars of board work. I think fiduciary is really solid. Strategic, yes. So, and this is probably one that you can play with a bit. And there's ways to do that in terms of how do you help people ask those questions so that when you do need to sort of go into this mode, it's not brand new to you. And there's a reason we're good at this. I think why boards have a really great advantage in that generative work, that thought, sense making, what's really come up, is you have the power. It's your job. I mean, this is your job to doing what's best, and not just from today and tomorrow, but for years to come potentially. There is plurality. I think the biggest power, the biggest strength that boards have is you have this group of people who are not the same, and you bring in different perspectives, different ways of thinking, different ways of interacting, and the combination of that plurality is where the magic really starts to happen, should you choose it well. And the position, again, you're not doing the day-to-day work. You're not saying, we got funding reports to write, staff to oversee, and all kinds of stuff to do. Your job is to step back and to be that sort of higher level voice of wisdom and reason in a board and organization. So great role for the boards to have because of all those kind of things. So some things to think about here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Liz. We'll do some questions at the end here. Just if you're looking for resources, lots of them. If this doesn't sort of meet your need, there's lots of them out there. These are a few that we like to sort of, the Imagine Canada Standards Handbook, I think they just changed the name of this, actually, we should change it. It's called Accredited Canada, perhaps, or something like that. But it's, the Imagine Canada is the umbrella group for the charitable sector in Canada. They have a standards program, HR board, some finance stuff. What I like about this, you don't have to go through the accreditation process and pay for it. You can get the guidelines saying, for an organization of a certain size, a small organization, these are the kind of things you need for standards for governance. Really good. So give you some guidelines. You're not just sort of making stuff up. And they give you some things and some resources. Should you choose to be accredited, and there's pros and cons to that, go through it. But the tools themselves can be used by any organizations. The board development program, Alberta Culture Community Development Unit, great resources. They do some training like this, not as good as this, but still, hey, your choice. They used to come around and do workshops. They don't do that as much. So they got some good resources, some good print materials, Mootart Foundation paper, some great manuals and stuff there. They do some training. They got a video series, so on demand, some good resources there for you. Always good to take a look at that stuff. Again, it says Chartered Professional Accountants. I'll check their name. CPAC. Accountants, Canada. You'll figure it out. All kinds of great stuff there. They're my go-to place when I need to find an answer or look like I know stuff. I go to them because that's a great place to read and then put it back to you folks. And then Board Source. Board Source is an American one. So again, a bit of a caveat there. So regulatory stuff, probably give that a bit of a miss. But how boards work together, that cultural piece, the team piece, how you're the CEO, those aren't regionally, or nationally super relevant, the stuff there. So you can take some pieces there. Again, when you're using stuff from outside your jurisdiction, make sure that you're really clear on what it means inside your jurisdiction. If those do not give you enough reading for the next 2 or 3 days, reach out and find out stuff to read. There's all kinds of stuff out there. We got kinds of resources out there. So if you're looking for something on a certain topic, this is what we're here for, is to help you with that kind of stuff. So we have a couple minutes left. I'm tired of talking. So I'm going to turn back to Liz to walk us through whatever's left. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. And I might have to throw it back to you if my internet is so choppy that I turn into a robot, Mike. So if at any point it sounds terrible, please cut me off and take over.
I'm thinking about robotic workers now. Employees, a great idea. Yeah.
I swear I'm a real person. But we didn't really have any questions in the chat. We do have one common question maybe we can just address in these last 5 minutes, and then I'll go into a couple of the resources that we have. Does that sound okay? So our one basic question is, what's the difference between what some terms out there, I've heard working board and I've heard governing board. Could you just briefly define the difference there?
All boards govern. Everyone is a governing board. That's the standard. 30,000 nonprofits, you all govern. So where it becomes different is how the work gets done. So we're all governing, but we want to do some things. In organizations that have a senior staff person, they're going to say, we're going to delegate the work to that senior staff person who's going to then hire people or whatever it's going to be. So I have a delegation of authority from my board. My board is governing. They say, Mike, here's the things in a delegation of authority, things you can't do, things you shouldn't do, things you need to report to us on. So the work gets done by myself and the staff and some of our volunteers. For organizations that don't have that senior staff, maybe you're starting out, maybe you're small, not all organizations want to have staff. They do the governance function, but then the work needs to get done. So then there's a bit of a gap there. And sometimes it's not a real gap because you can do it in the same meeting in the same way, but we need to do the work. So if we did not have a staff, an integral org, then we'd have volunteers doing some of the education stuff or some of the consulting work that we do, things like that. It may well be the same people, and that's where it gets confusing, is to say, am I working right now as a volunteer doing the work of the organization, or am I working as a volunteer doing the governance of the organization, even though I'm the same person? So that's why the metaphor of hats is really, I think, powerful, is to say, I'm wearing my governance hat. It says, I'm a governor, maybe. And I'm now wearing a hat that says I'm a volunteer or a worker doing the work in the organization. And they are different. And it's important for people outside the organization to say, or even for staff. Sometimes you have board members who volunteer at certain events and to say, am I here beside a board member who I should be intimidated by or has the authority to fire and fire, whatever it might be? No, I'm just a volunteer working alongside you. So that clarity isn't just for us doing the work, but people outside the organization, inside the organization. So who does the work? Is it clear in what hat you're wearing? Is probably it. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. I guess we'll just go into our next few resources. So I wanted to bring attention to a brand new workshop that we're hosting. It's going to be happening on November 23rd. And there we go. And it's called the Healthy Board, Collaborative Communication for Nonprofit Boards and Teams. And, we chatted about attending to the board's health and their ability to do teamwork and to make decisions and to debate in a constructive way. And so that's why we launched this workshop topic. Interpersonal communication influences all the things that boards might be doing, running productive meetings, relationship building, or bigger things like working through changes in leadership, doing strategy work. So this session will include lots of opportunities to refine those communication skills, and it's a great fit for individual board members, board teams, or individual leaders, or working teams as well. Yeah. So beyond that, we have our survey. We're always open to hearing your feedback on the topics that you're interested in. And we have gone through a different sort of way of doing our workshop process. So we'd like to hear any feedback on that. And consultations, yeah. So, like Mike said, if you have any sorts of questions, we do work in lots of different areas, as you can see in that little bubble there. But consultations are free, and they're just part of our mission to educate and support folks like you. So you can find out more about our consultations and clinics by visiting our website or contacting our main number. You can also email me if you want. Yeah, and I think what we have next is our wrap up there. So thank you everyone so much for attending and for your time and engagement, and feel free to reach out if you need any other support.
Thanks, folks. Hope to hear from you and have a wonderful day.